Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, a non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is April 28th, and I'm delighted to be here with Huwaida Arraf. Huwaida is a Palestinian-American civil rights attorney and human rights activist. She was co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, and she ran for Congress in Michigan last year. We're here to talk about a series of events that have taken place with Huwaida at the center in Michigan, starting last month in March. And Huwaida, I wanted to just start by asking you about that.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So in March, you were asked to speak at Bloomfield Hills High School in Michigan. And I'd like you to just, I think this is a story that has, national resonance because of the way in which Palestinian Americans are often silenced when they try to talk about Palestinian rights. But maybe you can just talk a little bit about what you said at the high school and then the resulting consequences.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's important to lay out that it was a diversity assembly at the high school, and it was planned and run by students, largely, if not exclusively, women students of color. And it was in response to some racist incidents that had taken place in previous years. So this was the second year of the diversity assembly, and they reached out to me about being one of the speakers. They initially said they wanted to have speakers speak about their experience with racism, maybe when they were in high school. And I said, look, I don't remember much of that, but I can certainly talk if you want about my experience with racism and discrimination in my work campaigning for Palestinian rights. And they said that would be perfect because it was a result, because of my work campaigning for Palestinian rights is one of the reasons that they reached out to me. So I agreed, and I was one of 5 speakers. We had an Asian American, a trans speaker, and 2 African Americans. And it was an assembly for the whole school divided by grade. So there were 4 assemblies, and we each spoke for a few minutes. I basically spoke about my experience growing up in the United States, why my parents came to this country because they wanted freedom and opportunity for their children, and that's not available to Palestinians living, whether in 48 as second, third class citizens or under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank or Gaza. So they came to the United States. I had a relatively decent, privileged childhood. And after college, I decided to go to Jerusalem in the hopes of learning more and seeing if I can contribute to change. This is what I told the students. I originally went to work for a conflict resolution program that brought people together, students, youth together to get to know each other, but quickly came to see that that's not enough. It's not enough to have a friend from the other side. And oftentimes this is used to make people feel good, like they're doing something, and it's not, because you're not actually doing anything to dismantle the structure that tear people apart or that oppress people. And so I ended up leaving that program and co-founding what's called the International Solidarity Movement. And I told them that the International Solidarity Movement brought people from all over the world, all kinds of nationalities and religions, to come and stand with Palestinians against these policies that oppress them. And so stand on the side of freedom versus occupation. And one thing that I stressed, and I wanted the students to understand, is that this isn't about Jews versus Muslims, or Jews versus Christians and Muslims, or Israelis and Palestinians. This is about freedom versus occupation. And I told them that many Jews, Israeli Jews, European, American Jews have come with the International Solidarity Movement and have stood and continue to stand with Palestinians in their fight for freedom. And then I left them with a message of, how this applies to their daily life, in that always be cognizant of any attempts to divide people because of differences. And in your homes, in your communities, in your schools, and when you go out into the world, if you do that, if you can get away from identity politics and just make sure that your actions are always contributing to everyone being able to have the same freedoms that you want for yourself, then you will surely help make this world a better place. And I thought it was a very unifying message. I didn't speak in a lot of detail actually about Palestine, but I did let them know that Palestinians are not free. Israel is occupying them. There are policies like home demolitions. Gaza is completely closed. So while I didn't go into a lot of detail, all of that was in 7 minutes. And yet, following the assembly, there was uproar. I heard about it the next morning when I saw press releases put out by the Jewish Community Relations Center and the American Jewish Council, basically condemning the school for having me, saying that, I just bashed Israel, and other people saying it descended into ugliness of I'm a known anti-Semite, and I spewed anti-Semitic rhetoric and all of these things, which I figured there might be some pushback, because anytime you talk about Palestinian rights, some people want to push back, but the degree of venom I felt here, like deliberate lies and racist tropes that were used to completely distort my participation in what I said, and then to call for the administrators of the school to be held accountable, to be fired, I thought was extreme. And it's still ongoing. Unfortunately, just this morning, I read that the principal, who had been put on administrative leave, announced his resignation. And last week, the superintendent announced his resignation.
Because of this.
All of the reports tie it to this. Yes, I can't be for sure. I don't have direct contact with them, but the reports tie it to this.
And what was the reaction from the students to your talk?
While I was there, I thought there were some great questions after. There were questions dispersed amongst the five speakers, very thoughtful ones. One of the questions I remember is a student actually saying, because I had commented about the fact that people who speak up for Palestinian rights end up wrongly being accused of being anti-Semitic, or if they're Jewish, they're called self-hating Jews. And it's important to distinguish between, legitimate criticism of the policies of a state and true anti-Semitism. And when you conflate, it does a big disservice to the fight against the real fight that needs to be had against anti-Semitism. So a student asked me, like, how do you do this work and avoid being called, anti-Semitism? Other people wanted to know how to get involved. So I thought some thoughtful questions. I did not notice any kind of consternation, but again, it was a big auditorium. I couldn't actually see the faces of the students. So I'm sure the questions didn't reflect what everyone was feeling. I'm sure that some students were feeling uncomfortable. Bloomfield Hills does have a large Jewish population. The principal of the school did tell me this, and I said, in response, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. That shouldn't mean that I shouldn't speak about Palestinian rights, because a lot of Jewish Americans, it's not a religious thing, a lot of Jewish Americans actually stand with Palestinians in this struggle, and there are they make up a good number of the people that I actually work with, and we can't shy away from certain things because it might make certain people uncomfortable. It's unfortunate, I think, that what has come out of this, like what I have heard from the parents, there was a school board meeting a few days later that was recorded, and just some of the things that were said were horrific. I mean, not only was I kind of defamed, let's say I'm used to that, but the kind of things that they were saying about having me in the school made their kids feel uncomfortable and they don't feel safe anymore. And this, where does this come from, that a Palestinian speaking about her experience or about Palestinian human rights? I mean, it can't be denied that Palestinians are occupied. It's an oppressive system they're living under. So just mentioning this suddenly makes some students feel unsafe. That kind of mentality, I think, is unfortunate and needs to be called out and needs to be confronted. It's not necessarily the students' fault, but I think it is the parents and the system that enables that, the organizations that foster that. And it's one of the reasons that we are, when I say we, I've been working with Jewish Voice for Peace, which is planning a town hall in Bloomfield Hills in the library to discuss what happened and the fact that speaking about Palestinian rights is not anti-Semitic, and we have a good mix of speakers because we want to take this on. We know that this tactic of raising this kind of outrage and pushback and demands for accountability when a Palestinian is allowed to speak has harmed a lot of people's job security and other things, and it creates a chilling effect where people then become weary about giving a platform to talk about Palestinian rights. So people are effectively silenced, and I think it needs to be called out whenever it happens in order to confront it.
Yeah, it also strikes me as deeply ironic, given that one of the points that kind of political conservatives have made in recent years, including a lot of Jewish political conservatives, is that actually that we should not have such things as safe spaces, that we should allow the students, that part of an education means hearing things that make you uncomfortable, and that part of what's wrong with progressivism today is that people are not exposed to views that they might disagree with and that might challenge them. And here's a situation where it sounds like they're invoking that very same language of safe spaces to basically say that for high school students to be hearing a speaker who may offer an opinion that's challenging to them is somehow illegitimate because it makes them unsafe.
Exactly. There was actually a few people that said this kind of stuff doesn't belong in our schools, where kids should be learning about like math and science. Mm-hmm. And that's it. So what's going on in the world, what's happening, current affairs, that they shouldn't be learning that. So it descended into some things that were really obnoxious and unfortunate, but we are I want to look at this as an opportunity to educate, to turn things around. I mean, the fallout has been horrific. And as I mentioned, at least 2 jobs now have been lost. I don't know if that will be able to be turned around, but if people can learn something from this and be exposed, and we can build on it to confront this wherever it happens, I think that might be a positive outcome. We're looking forward to the town hall actually having a good number of students participate in it.
So I'm curious, you talk, how much do you feel that Palestinian Americans, and obviously there's a significant Palestinian American population in Michigan, have to practice self-censorship on this issue, given fears of kind of repercussions like the ones that you've experienced now?
I think it varies. What happened too, also, I didn't mention in this school, and another unfortunate outcome is that a lot of the students who identify as either a Muslim American or Arab American were subjected to threats, even death threats, after the assembly. So it really, rather than being what it was intended to be, to expose students to diverse kind of points of views and make people more aware of the harms of racism and of division, it seems to have exacerbated that. And that, I believe, is a direct result of the frenzy that was caused by these press releases that were put out saying that the host, the school allowed an anti-Semitic speaker to spew anti-Semitic rhetoric to their students. Again, totally false. But a lot of students felt threatened and intimidated. A lot of people, parents.
You mean Arab and Muslim students?
Yes, in Bloomfield Hills High School specifically. And I had a number of parents write to me to thank me actually for speaking and for standing up and saying that I helped give their kids a voice, and their kids felt more empowered even in the wake of this kind of hostile environment at the school. But nationally, I think it is a consideration, or it has been. I hope it's changing. We do have a lot more support systems, I would say, for people that find themselves attacked because of their of advocating for Palestinian rights or speaking up about Palestinian rights. But in years past, sure, some people didn't even want anyone to know, for example, they were Palestinian, because of the hostile environment, because of the kind of misconceptions about what Palestinians, what the Palestinian struggle is all about. But through the organizing work that's been done over the past couple decades, we have institutions like Palestine Legal, for example, where students can turn to for help, and which have also been supportive in my case. Jewish Voice for Peace, which has grown tremendously and which kind of uses its platform to also support Palestinian voices and other organizations. And I think that, I hope that it helps people feel not afraid, at least to speak out, or not feel like they have to self-censor.
It strikes me that, to listen to you, that, you know, Michigan is in some ways a real ground zero of a kind for some of these fights. I mean, with, you know, Rashida Tlaib, and then the Andy Levin's race for Congress, obviously just a state that has a large Palestinian as well as Arab and Muslim population, and a significant Jewish population. Do you think that the climate for a kind of more open reckoning with questions of Palestinian rights, that climate is significantly better than it was 5 or 10 years ago? I mean, one might unfortunately draw the conclusion from what happened with your event that actually things are as bad as they ever were.
That is an interesting question. And, you know, I'll tell you something else interesting, that a couple of weeks after this event, I was invited to an interfaith iftar at a local mosque. And who do I meet there but the rabbi who is in charge of the JCRC and the the American Jewish Council, who put out the press release against me. And he was very kind of kind to my face. And I called him out on it. I said, you called me an anti-Semite. And he tried to just sweep that under the rug, but it suggested that we work together, or we try to work together, which I am open to. What I'm not open to, and I think where some of the division comes, is that Palestinians, for way too long, for over 3 decades now, have been told to, you know, we need to dialogue, and we need to make concessions, and we are asking for basic freedoms, and are told that our demands are too extreme. So it's not about just dialoguing anymore, which goes back to when I said I was working for this conflict resolution program. Dialogue is good. I will talk to anyone, but not in place of doing the work that needs to be done to dismantle the structure that is oppressing Palestinians. And so that goes for even in our speech. Let's not shy away from calling it what's happening. Someone tried to say to me, well, you know, the word apartheid kind of rubs some people the wrong way. Like, well, that you have to call things out as they are. And I realize it might take some people a little bit longer to come along. And that's what I think that what we're seeing here. No one will want to tell you that they're opposed to Palestinian human rights, but if you call things as they are, that's a little bit too extreme, and you need to slow down, or you're not the right person to work with. And I think that we have that division here. And if we look at, for example, Andy Levin, I mean, what did he say that was so extreme? And yet he was targeted by all these pro-Israel groups because he, you know, speaks up for basic Palestinian rights. So is Michigan kind of a ground zero or something for this? We have a long way to go here. I think the groups that we have here are, at least the pro-Israel groups that we have here, are fairly strong, but they don't extend everywhere. And when I was running for office last year, my campaign conducted a poll in my district and amongst Democratic voters, because I ran for the Democratic nomination. And what we said was, Huwaida will likely advocate for cutting aid to Israel based on their human rights abuses. Do you consider this a strong reason to vote for her, a reason to vote for her, or not a reason to vote for her? And we had about 67% saying it was a strong reason or a reason to vote for me in my district. So I think there's a lot of room, a lot of work to be done, but there is a lot of work to be done still.
I wanted to go back to the point you were just making earlier about when dialogue is constructive and when it's not constructive. You said you would talk to anyone, but you also said that you worried that these dialogues could be a substitute for action that actually brings change. And this is obviously a larger subject, since the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, has a position on anti-normalization, specifically with that can limit interactions with Israeli Jewish institutions. And so I'm curious how where you draw that line, and what are the circumstances where having a conversation is valuable because it provides an opportunity for education and growing empathy, which might lead people to change their behavior in ways that promotes freedom and justice. And how do you distinguish between that and a conversation in which you feel like the conversation will not ultimately lead to movement towards freedom and justice?
That is a great question. When I say I talk to anyone, this is kind of on a personal level, or I would invite them over, or I would go to their place. But where I believe that it becomes harmful and actually counter or starts to be harmful basically to the Palestinian liberation struggle is where these are institutionalized in programs that tend to take the place of doing the work that's necessary. Like if we even look at what the US government advocates, millions that are set aside for in the US budget to support normalization programs or people-to-people programs. And these are then touted as substitutes basically for the organizations or for doing the work. So I can still talk to somebody that doesn't agree with me, but advocate for BDS. It can't be where programs are, bringing people together and encouraging normalization and dialogue, and then that is used to slam or vilify or negate the importance of boycott, divestment, sanction also as a strategy. That becomes harmful to the struggle. And that's what happens a lot is you get policymakers and others that want to pour money or energy into bringing people together and dialoguing, and then pass resolutions to condemn BDS. No, that is the harm that I believe is done. But on a personal level, I believe talk is always good in order to hopefully bring people along. But when they're institutionalized in programs that tend to take the place of, again, the work that needs to be done to dismantle the racist and apartheid structures, then it becomes harmful. Does that make sense? Did I?
Yes. Another question I wanted to ask, it seems to me that I would imagine one of the challenges that Palestinian activists like yourself face is that so often charges of anti-Semitism are used to divert the conversation away from the question of Palestinian rights, that one has to decide how much time one is going to spend arguing that these are not actually anti-Semitic, and how much one is just going to ignore that as essentially a kind of diversion, right? And just focus on the question of the question of Palestinian freedom. And I'm just curious for yourself how you think about that. How much you think it's productive to try to argue against claims that Palestinian advocates are anti-Semitic versus essentially just saying that that's ultimately not a productive conversation because the argument oftentimes is not really be made in good faith.
Yeah, I question myself all the time when I see some bogus comments on social media to something that I post. I almost want to engage, but then realize that that's not a good platform, and it's going to be a time suck, and it's not going to actually lead anywhere. I think stating quite clearly that criticism of a state is not, or state policy is not anti-Semitism. I mean, that's clear. What I feel like those who try to silence talk on Palestinian rights try to say as well yes, okay, criticizing Israeli policy may in itself not be anti-Semitic, but trying to delegitimize Israel, that's anti-Semitic. Now, what I say there is, look, what I am advocating for is freedom and equality and human rights for everybody. And that is not dependent on what you identify with religiously or otherwise. And so if me doing that is somehow delegitimizing the Israeli state, then you need to have a conversation with yourself about what you think the Israeli state stands for and why that is okay with you. And so I always bring it back to not like a one state or two states or what rights the Israeli state has. It is what rights the people have that live in that area. And every single person should have the right to live with freedom, equality, dignity on their land, the land of their ancestors, and the refugees that are abroad, of course, come home. Again, it is about these shared rights. And that I feel people have a hard time that want to defend Israel have a hard time answering, because then they have to go and say that Israel needs to be a Jewish state and come up with reasons why that is, which then descends into these racist tropes about Palestinians and who they are as people not necessarily deserving of, if Israelis didn't have their own state, or if they lived in one state with Palestinians, and that would somehow pose a danger to them. And then you have to kind of deconstruct that. So I don't get into a lot of these discussions about, is it anti-Semitic or is it not anti-Semitic? It is not. And if you think it is because my talk about Palestinian freedom and equality delegitimizes the state of Israel, then that's, something that you have to think about, you and yourself, not something that I am going to get into. I always bring it back to a rights framework.
Yeah, I have to say, I find it often quite odd and ironic that there's so much focus from organized Jewish institutions on this demand that, that one recognize that Israel as a state has a right to exist as a Jewish state, and it's anti-Semitic to suggest otherwise. Because as I look at Jewish texts and Jewish tradition, I see very little basis for a claim that it's inherent in Judaism that any particular state has a right to exist. Indeed, that actually what our texts teach is that human beings have a right to exist in dignity, because human beings are created in the image of God, not countries. And in fact, and that states are judged, including in our own texts, they are judged by the way they treat human beings. And if those states violate basic rights of human beings, then they deserve to be replaced by states that do a better job of that. So it seems to me a kind of a form of idolatry to suggest that the existence of states matters more than the existence of human beings. And yet that's ultimately what a lot of this discourse kind of comes down to.
That's 100%. When I am asked that, like, do you believe Israel has a right to exist? I say, states don't have rights, people have rights. And if a state cannot respect the rights of the people that it governs, then we have an issue there. So I don't put states' rights over people's rights. So I think you're exactly right. And it goes back to, as you said, even in your own religious text, that is confirmed. But like I said, I think there's a lot of, and you would know better than I, but I was just having a discussion with a rabbi the other day who talked about a lot of these preconceived notions or the training that she got growing up, or kids get growing up, where they just see things a certain way, and the very talk about Palestine or Palestinian rights is seen as an attack on them. And I think that that's probably what some of the students sitting in that auditorium felt, and that is what's unfortunate. And I think that's really what I would like the result of the town hall that we're having and follow-up work to address why people need to, why people feel that way, and having them themselves question that if we can get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems to me that one of the challenges that many of us face is that we may be members of a certain ethnic or religious group that we may be very, very attached to, and we may love very deeply, but in terms of our political actions, we need to form communities with people who share our basic beliefs in equality under the law and freedom for all people, and that then cuts across religious communities, and that Jews need to be struggling with Muslims and Christians and everybody else for those principles, because within every one of our groups we have a divide between people who believe in the idea of human equality and, sadly, people who don't. And I really appreciate, I know you have many people who said this to you, but I want to add my voice to them that I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I think that the work you're doing in building alliances between Palestinians and Jews and other people based around shared principles about the way all human beings should be treated, it seems to me, is vital, not only for Israel-Palestine, but it's vital for for our life in the United States as well.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to do my part. You always feel like it's never enough, but it's what we need to do, right? There is just too much hatred and division. And like you said, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but what we're seeing in the United States today, it all comes back to this kind of same thing. And if we can get past that and just realize that everybody deserves the same rights we want for ourselves, and if we can learn to respect that and work towards that, we'd have this world would be a much kinder, gentler place, I think.
Yeah. Huwaida, thank you so much for spending the time with us, and good luck at your in your forthcoming work. I hope more people will be able to hear your voice and listen to it rather than trying to shut it down.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Sure.